아름다운 제주 섬에는
On the beautiful island of Jeju, there is painful Korean history. Precisely because records and memories of the events of the Jeju April 3 incident remain here, at times the island's splendorous beauty can pain one's heart. What does the Jeju April 3 incident mean to you? It is a history stained with tears that took blood and sweat to reach the world. It is a history of harrowing tribulations. The Jeju April 3 Peace Memorial Hall behind me here allows us to see in detail the history of the Jeju April 3 incident and asks us to reflect on what work is left to do by looking back on the past for the sake of our future. At one time, this story was banned, a trauma many wanted to hide away. But it is a history we must now confront. My name is Taesong. Together, let's take a look at the records of the Jeju April 3 incident. Let us return to the site of this history roughly 70 years ago. The volcanic island of Jeju is home to many caves. At the time of the Jeju April 3 incident, caves served as refuges for the people of Jeju. However, these caves were eventually found by the punitive forces and were thus a site of much pain and death as well.
This
is a tombstone without a name, white stone. The events of April 3 have been called an uprising, a struggle, a riot, a massacre, an incident, and more. Despite the numerous names used to refer to it, it has no name of its own. Someday we must carve the proper name into this tombstone and let it stand tall. In the year 1945, a fierce battle between the U.S. and Japan ensued in Asia. In June of that year, American forces occupying Okinawa in Japan made plans to occupy the Japanese mainland by attacking Kyushu and Jeju. In order to prevent this, Japan deployed approximately 70,000 troops to Jeju. Japan mobilized Jeju residents to construct mines and underground bases along the slopes of Mount Hala and Jeju's Orum, parasitic cones. Japan planned that once U.S. forces landed on Jeju, Japanese forces would hide in the densely forested areas on Mount Hala and wage guerrilla warfare until the very end. This map of troop placement vividly demonstrates the situation at the time. If the war had lasted just 1 month longer, Jeju could have become a sea of fire akin to what happened on Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa took a toll of 200,000 lives. The people of Jeju fortunately avoided such a tragedy with Korea's liberation from Japan. However, soon after they would undergo the tremendous hardship of the Jeju April 3 incident. Having won the war, American forces held a surrender ceremony for Japanese troops on Jeju, separate from the one in Seoul. This is a testament to just how critical a position Jeju held. Finally, the Korean peninsula was free after 35 years of Japanese colonial occupation. Koreans took delight in their liberation. As soon as Korea was freed from Japan, some 60,000 young people who had left Jeju returned to their homes on the island, their hearts overflowing with hope. These young people returning to the newly free Jeju focused their efforts on two activities: self-government and education.
이 자치 활동은
The campaign for self-government was launched by the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence and was continued by the People's Committees. The People's Committees of the time were akin to community governance associations today. The Jeju People's Committee ran smoothly without any major clashes with U.S. military units stationed on Jeju. A night school was opened in each village and a school in each region. Directly following liberation, Jeju had the highest ratio of school graduates to population. That should give you a sense of just how strong the desire to learn was on Jeju at the time. In September 1945, the flag of Japan was removed from the Japanese Government General Building in Seoul. But can you make out what went up in its place? It wasn't the Korean flag, but the American flag. Immediately following Japan's surrender, American and Soviet forces flocked to the Korean peninsula. Under the pretext of disarming Japanese forces, the Americans and the Soviets divided Korea along the 38th parallel and occupied it, thus beginning the U.S. Army military government in Korea south of the 38th parallel. The tragedy of the Jeju April 3 incident began precisely with this line drawn by the U.S. and the USSR. I say this because of the unspeakable harm inflicted during the attempt to reverse this decision and reunite Korea. USAMGIK began putting out half-baked policies. At first, it liberalized the grain market. Immediately after doing so, rice prices skyrocketed. Then USAMGIK revived the government-regulated system that was in place at the end of Japanese colonial rule. This flip-flopping, of course, was met with resistance by farmers. That was not all. USAMGIK continued to appoint the civil servants and police who had served under Japan's colonial rule. Retaining the majority of the colonial governing apparatus gave Koreans who had collaborated with the Japanese even more power. The officials working for the military government were corrupt as well. This could not help but dishearten the people who had dreamt of a new world following independence. The same went for Jeju. So the U.S. military landed on Jeju, and Major Stout was appointed as the commanding officer for the USAMGIK company on Jeju. By continuing to appoint police and officials who had worked in the colonial government, Major Stout provoked public resentment. On April 3, 1948, rebel forces raided a police substation. Thus began the Jeju April 3 incident. But in order to truly understand this incident, we must first look back at a shooting that happened on March 1, 1947. Celebrations of the March 1st movement were held throughout Korea as Koreans aspired to build an independent nation. A grand celebration of the March 1st movement was held in Jeju as well. An unprecedented crowd of 30,000 people gathered in front of the Jeju North Elementary School. Following the celebratory rally, young people organized a street demonstration for Korean independence. In the process of dispersing the crowd, there was an unexpected occurrence. This was the catalyst for the uprising that took place a year later on April 3rd.
49세의 농부,
a 49-year-old farmer, a child in the 5th grade, a woman in her 20s with a child in her arms, and others. 6 civilians died, and 6 others were injured in the shooting. Those hurt or killed in the shooting were not part of the protest, but they were there to watch the protest. This could be considered a preview of what was to come in the Jeju April 3 incident. The police officer who fired was not a Jeju police officer, but a backup officer from the mainland. This officer began firing at random after losing his nerve amid the crowds of people. Public rage and grief were funneled into a general strike that began on March 10th. Administrative buildings, such as the provincial office and county office, as well as the courts, the prosecution service, private companies, schools, and stores all closed their doors. Even 66 police officers from Jeju participated in the strike. With 166 organizations and more than 41,000 people taking part, this was a general strike the likes of which had never been seen in the world. USAMGIK, which governed South Korea at the time, had no intention of winning over hearts and minds. In fact, their bias made them suspicious of the Jeju people. At the time, they started calling Jeju the Red Island. USAMGIK excluded Jeju people from key administrative positions and distrusted the Jeju police. In the end, around 400 police from the mainland were dispatched to Jeju. Even members of the far-right group, the Northwest Youth League, were sent to Jeju. These forces began to seize control over the police, government bodies, schools, and more. And on the pretext of supposedly hunting down commies, they provoked the Jeju public with their ruthless acts of terror. This was yet another factor behind the Jeju uprising.
서청원이 아니고는 내가 일할 수 없다. 그러니까 사상이 철저한 서청원을 각지 방방곡곡에 투입식해서 이 사태를 진화해 나왔다. 이렇게 말해요. 중창들랑 없이 낳은 아이 죽이고 끓이는 아이 죽이고 아이고 서북 청년처럼 험한 것들은 싶더라. 아무래도 닥친 것만 죽이지는 한 게.
무서웠어.
누가 합니까? 그 바티강우람서도 지네 이제 산에 연락강우람 쟁쟁하고.
학교 애들 다 가린 몰아놓은 갈중이 빠랑애들 학교 마당 애들 갔어 이게. 간 그디 간에 한 새로 서너 식구지 그디서 있을 거라. 전부 눈꼬물인 해에 댕기 먹으면 손가락질 하면은 뻐바나고 가만.
The police reinforcements in the Northwest Youth League captured 2,500 young people in Jeju over a year's time on the pretext of the strike. Some records state that 35 people were held in jail cells measuring about 11 square meters. 1 month prior to the uprising on April 3rd, 3 of the students and young people being held by the police died under torture. On March 6, Kim Yong-chol, a second-year middle schooler, died at Jocheon Police Station. On March 14th, Young Eun-ha died at Mosopo Police Station. And on March 29th, Park Heng-koo was killed by the Northwest Youth League.
한라산 기슭
At the
오름마다
foot of each odom near Mount Hala, torches burned bright. If they suppress us, we will fight back. Protesting the oppression by the police and the Northwest Youth League, and along with calls for the unification of an independent Korea and the complete liberation of the Korean people, and in protest of the separate elections and separate government for the southern part of Korea, members of the Jeju branch of the Workers' Party of South Korea began an armed uprising.
누가 시킨 것도
They were not acting on anyone's orders.
오롯이 스스로 일어난
The people of Jeju
사람들이었습니다.
rose up on their own. At the time of the uprising, the rebels' weapons amounted to 27 old guns from the Japanese occupation, 3 pistols, and 25 grenades. The rest were armed with bamboo spears. In comparison to the punitive forces armed with U.S. military gear, the rebels' weapons were wildly inadequate and inferior. At the time, USAMGIK decided to go forward with an election only in the area south of the 38th parallel, while national leaders such as Kim Gu and Kim Kyu-shik declared that any election in only half of Korea is unacceptable. These voices speaking out against the establishment of half a country coalesced into the Jeju uprising. USAGMIK tried to suppress the uprising at first, but when that didn't go as anticipated, they mobilized troops to suppress it. A warning of massive bloodshed was issued. Kim Ik-rol, commander of the 9th Regiment, attempted to prevent this. On April 22nd, flyers proposing peace talks were scattered from an airplane. Then, at the end of April, Kim Ik-rol met with Kim Dal-sam, leader of the rebel forces, and began peace talks. What do you suppose came out of those talks? Fortunately, there was an enthusiastic agreement to suspend fighting and refrain from attacks after 72 hours.
그런데 말입니다.
But something happened. Just 3 days after the suspension of hostilities on May 1st, a group of young people attacked Jeju's Ora village and set fire to a private abode. The view of that house burning was captured very vividly by the U.S. military's COMCAM team on the ground and in the air. That was recorded in a silent film called Mayday in Korea, Jeju-do.
어렵게 성사된
Who was
평화
responsible for this arson, which triggered the breakdown of the hard-fought peace talks? At the time, the police accused rioters of the deed. But when Colonel Kim Ik-rul conducted an investigation, he found that the fire had been set by members of a right-wing youth league with the support of the police. But wouldn't you know it? The findings of this investigation went disregarded, and Colonel Kim Ik-rul was suddenly relieved of his position. What was happening in Jeju could have been resolved peacefully, but instead the situation once again descended into chaos. We're looking at a piece of artwork by artist Kang Yo-bae called May 10 for the People of Jeju. There is tension behind it, but this tranquil-looking landscape does move onlookers. See the family climbing together, the rebel standing guard, and the young woman picking ferns? There's something admirable about this image of people going about their lives even in such a perilous situation.
이 광복과 동시에 이 남북이
Following liberation from Japan, the Korean peninsula was occupied by foreign troops, but we Koreans believed we would soon establish an independent, autonomous, and united country. But due to the Cold War between the U.S. and the USSR and the schism of political leaders, the fate of Korea was placed in the UN's hands, and ultimately an independent election was held for the southern half of Korea. Jeju took action to boycott the South-only election. In the end, Jeju made history as the only region in South Korea to reject the May 10 general election. Shocked, USAMGIK dispatched Colonel Brown to become Commander-in-Chief of Jeju, where he carried out a large-scale roundup. Catch every youth who is getting in the way of the election. In 6 weeks' time, the desperate U.S. forces managed to round up no fewer than 6,000 people, even setting up tent encampments to detain them. This tells us they turned up quite a few rioters who had not actually rioted. This is a certificate of release from prison. The name reads Hyun Yong-jun. Just how old was Young-jun, do you think?
몇 살이었을까요?
He was a boy of 15, in his second year of middle school. This single certificate shows us just how indiscriminate the U.S. forces roundup was. They thought doing this would scare the people of Jeju, but they had another thing coming. The re-election of June 23rd ended up failing as well. USAMGIK's shock turned to rage.
광복 3년째
On the
되던
third anniversary of Korea's independence, the government of the Republic of Korea was established. The events in Jeju transcended mere regional issues and were perceived as a challenge to the authority of the government. The new government under President Seung-man Rhee set up a security command on Jeju and sent soldiers from the mainland there. The punitive forces carried out a scorched earth operation in the upland villages for about 4 months, from mid-November 1948 to March 1949, burning the houses and slaughtering the inhabitants, regardless of their age or sex. The scorched earth operation treated the uplands, areas more than 5 kilometers from the coast, as an enemy area in which everything was to be wiped out. This brutal scorched earth operation was backed by the martial law decree issued by President Seung-man Rhee. The punitive forces carried out a large-scale evacuation of the upland villages. The residents of those villages were forcibly relocated to villages on the coast and forced to build stone walls to defend against the rebel forces. The walls measured 150 kilometers, or twice as long as the width of the entire island from east to west. The evacuated villagers had to stand watch night and day all along the wall. The uplands, which began 5 kilometers from the coast, make up 80% of the total area of Jeju Island. The residents in this area were shot regardless of their age or sex. And more than 40,000 houses in the upland villages were burned down. Surrounded by the ocean, the isolated island of Jeju was both a huge prison and a slaughterhouse. This is a piece titled Island of Death by Go Gil-chun. The massacres perpetrated by the Japanese during their colonial occupation were reportedly reenacted by the police and army during the Jeju April 3 incident.
암흑의 혐의는 없으면은 대신 나와 하거든. 대신 나와. 어머니도 좋고 아버지도 좋고 형님도 좋고 누가 딱 부르면은 없으면은 대신 나와 했어요. 대신 나와서 해가지고 그 사람도 그냥 죽었거든.
100명이 지르는 건지 200명이 지르는 건 꼭 밤중에 한다고. 떼내 그냥 바다로 던져야 되겠는데 다 묶어놓으시니까 던지를 못했거든. 그래서 배 안에서 전부 사격시견에 다 죽여놓고 바다에 다 돌자라면 그냥 1년으로 해내 그냥 뭐 낚싯줄 매듯 해내 그냥 막 던져본 거지.
초토화 작전을 집행한
Scorched Earth operation was carried out by Song Yo-chan, a regimental commander. He said he had been following orders from the highest level of the
이
government.
계엄령을
President Seung-man Rhee, who declared martial law and encouraged the deployment of the Northwest Youth League, ordered the brutal suppression of the Jeju uprising. Rhee justified this by claiming it was necessary to convince the U.S. to actively provide aid. Sure enough, the U.S. Military Advisory Group urged the government to quickly suppress the uprising. Brigadier General William L. Roberts, head of the Military Advisory Group, played a leading role in that. Roberts recommended that the regiment under Song Yo-chang be dispatched and praised his outstanding leadership in his unit's Scorched Earth operation. A fact-finding investigation by the government found that this operation was illegal under international law. The responsibility for that lay with the military leaders, President Seung-man Rhee, and also the U.S. Military Advisory Group. The rebel units also caused damage during the Scorched Earth operation. They carried out killings of police and right-wing figures and launched attacks on villages that didn't cooperate with them. A frequent but tragic occurrence during the terrible fighting was for relatives and neighbors to become informers and enemies. In March 1949, a new commander, Colonel Yu Jae-hong, was assigned to Jeju. The island had already been devastated by the Scorched Earth operation. Next up was a pacification operation. Residents of the upland villages relocated to coastal villages on the orders of the punitive troops. But when the troops' massacres continued, the residents went back up the mountain. While they eluded the punitive troops, they suffered extreme hardship while they were in hiding. Many of them starved or froze to death. And so, when these people fled into the uplands, the caves, and the mountain to hide from the punitive troops, leaflets were scattered on Mount Hala promising amnesty for those who came down from the mountain and defected. As rumors spread that those who came down from the mountains wouldn't be simply slaughtered, as in the past, the people who had taken refuge on Mount Hala came down from the mountain carrying white flags they had made by hanging clothing on branches. Most of the 8,000 people who came down from the mountain were old people, women, and children. But had the government been telling the truth when it promised not to punish their crimes? Among those who came down from the mountain, 1,700 were executed at so-called military tribunals. They were either shot at the Jeju airfield or locked up in prisons around the country. These were clearly illegal trials that failed to satisfy the minimum legal requirements. Korean courts have recently exonerated the people executed in this way. But is there any way these people can be compensated for the injustice and pain they suffered?
저기 개털로 허리띠. 이 마크는 여자 허리띠지. 여자 허리띠 마크라니까.
이게 학교 배지는 아니고.
쪽 배지가 뭐
충자 같은데 충자.
잠깐만요. 많이 틀어줘.
이곳은
This is an
1992년에
exact reproduction of Darangshi Cave, which was discovered in 1992. When the people hiding in Darangshi Cave during the incident refused to come out, the soldiers who had found them reportedly set fire to the entrance to suffocate them. How could that possibly be justified?
그건 옷인가요? 이 프로는 전년도가 여기 들어와지를 않았다는.
들어오지 않았다는 얘기죠.
대체적으로 연령층이 어떻습니까?
연령층은 다양하게 나타나네요. 보니까 뭐 10대 후반서부터 나이 한 60대 넘은 할머니 있는 정도까지 굉장히 다양하게 나타나는 것 같아요. 대부분은 한 청년층, 한 20, 30대, 20, 40대 정도의 젊은 층이 제일 많고요.
저기 이거 앉아도 될 건가? 예. 저 위에
단독 선거와 단독
The reason for opposing separate elections and separate governments was because they knew that if Korea were divided into North and South by foreign powers, it would ultimately lead to war. Only 2 years after separate governments were established, those fears became reality. The Korean War broke out on June 25, 1950. As the name suggests, preventive custody means detaining potential criminals before they actually commit a crime. There were 2 rounds of illegal military tribunals. As a result, 2,500 people were locked up in prisons around the country. Most of them were killed in group massacres after the Korean War broke out. The people who had been rounded up for illegal preventive custody were also shot, and their bodies buried in shallow graves or dumped into the ocean. The preventive custody and mass killings that took place in the Korean War after the Jeju April 3 incident are the cause of the missing in the title of this piece. The holes drilled into the metal plate signify the number of Jeju residents who went missing. The wires in the holes are said to signify the trajectory of bullets shot from gun barrels and into human bodies, linking the perpetrators with the victims.
During
the 15 years from the Jeju April 3 incident until 1962, about half of the displaced people returned home and rebuilt their villages. Despite a long campaign to resettle the displaced and rebuild their homes, 109 of their villages had vanished without a trace. These are known as the lost villages. Many people were injured and killed in the Jeju April 3 incident, and the various kinds of interrogation and torture that occurred during the illegal arrests caused disabilities that continue to cause pain to this day.
이 공간에는
This room summarizes the history of the investigation that brought the Jeju April 3 incident into the light after 50 years in the dark.
기억이 낯선
Where memory has been obliterated, there is no history. Without history, humanity does not exist. Those are the words of Kim Sok-pom, writer of Death of a Crow, the first Japanese novel to shed light on the Jeju April 3 incident. Kim's words express all the reasons we must remember and properly understand the Jeju April 3 incident.
반세기 가까이
The truth of the Jeju April 3 incident was kept in the dark for nearly half a century because of ideological conflict. There was an intense battle over memory to bring that truth to light. Thanks to these efforts, the Special Act on the Jeju April 3 incident was finally enacted in 2000. After many twists and turns, these efforts succeeded in bringing the Jeju April 3 incident out of the tunnel of concealment, distortion, and repression. The government carried out a fact-finding investigation, unearthing hundreds of bodies of victims of the Jeju April 3 incident around the island, including the Jeju Airport runway and the slopes of Odum.
해방 직후 정부 수립 과정에서 발생했던 이 불행한 사건의 역사적 매듭을 짚고 가야 한다고 생각합니다. 저는 위원회의 건의를 받아들여 국정을 책임지고 있는 대통령으로서 과거 국가 권력의 잘못에 대해 유족과 제주도민 여러분에게 진심으로 사과와 위로의 말씀을 드립니다.
2003년 10월 30일
Do you know what happened on October 31st, 2003? That was the day when the South Korean president apologized for the first time for this abuse of state power. This was a historical day when we moved one step down the path of peace and harmony, thanks to the passion and the struggle of so many people who wanted the full truth. Then, in 2014, April 3 was declared a National Memorial Day. On the remote island of Jeju, we have continued to live with strength and conviction despite the oppression and exploitation of the past. We have fought for and defended our homes, not only for ourselves, but for our neighbors and community. That is why we must remember the righteous people who sacrificed themselves to save innocent lives during the chaos of the massacres. They are the ones who made just refusals and brave choices. There are many names we ought to remember.
안녕하세요, 이사장님.
Hello, Chairman.
수고하셨습니다.
I appreciate your efforts. I've been learning a lot while looking around here, and I have a question for you. The Jeju April 3 incident must have involved a lot of ideological conflict. How did the reconciliation movement get underway? The truth about the incident has been thoroughly brought to light. That caused us to realize that so many Jeju residents lost their lives because of the great power conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. That gradually led to the reconciliation movement. Hagui Village set up a memorial site called Yeongmo-won, which houses separate memorial stones for the soldiers, police, and Jeju residents killed in the incident. These memorial stones carry the message that everyone should forgive because everyone is a victim. Then that movement gradually started spreading to other villages. So that's how it got started. That's right. You'd think there would be the most enmity between the Jeju April 3 Bereaved Families Association and the Jeju Police Veterans Association, but they made a statement of reconciliation. How did that happen? In 2013, the two associations made a statement of unconditional reconciliation. That was August 2nd, and they started holding a joint memorial service every year on that day. In the joint memorial service, people pay their respects together at the Chunghon Cemetery for service members and the Jeju April 3 Peace Park for the Jeju victims. That is how Jeju Island has become a symbol of reconciliation and harmony and has received attention from academics both in Korea and overseas. The Jeju Uprising represented the just and legitimate resistance of Jeju residents who dreamed of North and South Korea being truly unified as an independent country.
누구보다 먼저 꿈을 꾸었다는 이유로 제주는 처참한 죽음과 마주했고 통일정부 수립이라는 간절한 요구는 이념의 덫으로 돌아와 우리를 분열시켰습니다.
The Jeju April 3 incident has transcended pain and come to symbolize peace, human rights, reconciliation, and unification. It symbolizes sacrifice and a courageous attempt to set history right. The Jeju April 3 incident has emerged from a long tunnel of darkness into the light of truth and reconciliation. The Jeju April 3 incident was a painful episode in Korea's modern history. We must keep working to uncover the full truth and repair the reputations of the victims so that the incident can be recorded and remembered as a symbol of peace, unification, and human rights.